The stage was set. The grand hall was packed with people from all walks of life, their eyes fixed on the podium where Vice President J.D. Vance sat. The bright stage lights cast a golden glow over the room, amplifying the tension in the air. This was no ordinary night. Millions of Americans were tuned in, watching the live Q&A session with their vice president, eager to hear his thoughts on the nation's most pressing issues. J.D. Vance sat upright, his hands folded neatly on the table before him. His expression was calm, composed, and determined. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to answering tough questions, defending policies, and standing firm against political attacks. He had spoken on economic plans, border security, and the future of American leadership. But tonight there was something different, an unshakable sense of anticipation that hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The questions started off as expected, some sharp, others respectful, all of them political in nature. The vice president handled them with his usual poise, offering well-structured responses that reflected his experience. Yet beneath the surface there was an underlying tension, as if the moment everyone had been unknowingly waiting for had yet to arrive. The cameras panned across the audience, capturing the faces of concerned citizens, veterans, blue-collar workers, young conservatives, and elderly patriots who had lived through decades of American history. These were the people J.D. Vance had sworn to serve, the people whose voices mattered more than any headline or political scandal. And then suddenly, it happened. A frail hand rose from the middle of the crowd. It trembled slightly, yet there was something undeniably strong about the presence of the person it belonged to. The camera zoomed in, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair neatly combed back. She wore an old but pristine military jacket, adorned with medals that hinted at a lifetime of sacrifice. As she stood, a hush fell over the room. J.D. Vance's eyes locked onto hers. Something in her presence commanded respect, a quiet but powerful energy that made even the reporters put down their pens. She clutched the microphone, took a deep breath, and with a voice soft yet piercing, she asked a question that would change the course of the evening and perhaps the nation itself. The moment the elderly woman stood, the air in the grand hall shifted. The soft murmur of the audience faded into silence, replaced by an unspoken anticipation that gripped every soul present. Even the press, known for their relentless pursuit of headlines, momentarily lowered their pens. The weight of history seemed to press down on the room as she clutched the microphone, her frail hands trembling, yet her resolve unwavering. J.D. Vance had faced many challenges in his career. He had stood firm in the face of relentless political attacks, spoken confidently in high-stakes debates, and defended President Trump against the harshest criticisms. But as he looked into the eyes of this elderly woman, something in his chest tightened. This wasn't just another question. This wasn't a political attack or a policy critique. This was something much deeper. She wore an old but pristine military jacket, its medals gleaming softly under the stage lights. Each one told a story of courage, of sacrifice, of a life spent in service to something greater than oneself. The years had weathered her face, but her eyes still held the fierce determination of a soldier, of someone who had seen war, who had fought for the flag, who had carried burdens too great for most to understand. She took a deep breath. Her voice, though soft, cut through the stillness like a blade. It carried the weight of history, of generations who had lived and died believing in the promise of America. "If God is still there," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "why are people trying to bring down Donald Trump, the chosen savior of America, instead of standing with him?" The impact was immediate. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. The question didn't just hang in the air, it crashed over them like a tidal wave, pulling them into depths they hadn't anticipated. J.D. Vance's breath caught in his throat. He had expected tough questions on the economy, on foreign policy, on immigration, but this was different. It wasn't a question of politics. It was a question of faith, of destiny, of the very soul of the nation. His grip on the table tightened. He felt an unfamiliar pressure building in his chest, a sensation he hadn't expected, a deep, raw emotion clawing its way to the surface. He wanted to answer immediately, but for the first time in his career he found himself speechless. The elderly woman did not waver. She stood there, her frail frame barely holding back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Yet she was not crying. Her strength came not from defiance, but from a faith so deep, so unshakable, that it commanded respect. JD's vision blurred slightly. He blinked rapidly, willing himself to stay composed. But it was impossible. The weight of her question pressed against him, forcing him to confront something beyond politics, beyond strategy, beyond any debate he had ever engaged in. A murmur rippled through the audience. People shifted in their seats, their hands clenching the armrests. Some reached for tissues, others sat frozen, their expressions unreadable. Even the toughest reporters, hardened veterans of political journalism, remained motionless, as if afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile stillness that had overtaken the room. JD opened his mouth, then closed it. There were no prepared statements for this, no talking points handed to him by advisors. No speechwriters had crafted an answer for a moment like this. This wasn't just a question. This was a cry from the depths of the American soul. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion that passed across his face. The entire nation was watching, waiting. The elderly woman's eyes never left his. They searched his face, not for an easy answer, not for political reassurance, but for truth, for something real. JD inhaled sharply, his hands clenched into fists on the table, his fingers digging into the wood as if to ground himself. His throat tightened, and despite every effort to hold it back, a single tear welled in his eye. He let it fall. Somewhere in the audience, a muffled sob broke the silence. A young man in his 20s, barely more than a boy, sat with his hands clasped together, his face pale with emotion. A mother in the front row clutched her young son's hand, whispering something under her breath, perhaps a prayer. The weight of the moment was unbearable. JD swallowed hard. He had spent years fighting battles with words, with arguments, with logic, but this moment demanded something else, something deeper. He looked at the elderly woman again, and for the first time in his career, he had no answer, only the raw, unfiltered truth. JD Vance had faced pressure before. He had stood behind podiums, cameras flashing, as reporters fired relentless questions at him. He had endured personal attacks, political betrayals, and the weight of defending President Trump against critics who sought to destroy him. But never, not once, had he felt the way he did in this moment. His hands tightened around the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything but the heavy silence that had settled over the room. The elderly woman's question still hung in the air, suffocating, inescapable. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in his life, JD Vance was speechless. The camera zoomed in, capturing the raw emotion flickering across his face. His lips trembled slightly as he struggled to compose himself, to form words that could possibly match the depth of what had just been asked. But what words could? How could he answer something so profound, something that had struck at the very core of his soul? His vision blurred. He blinked quickly, trying to force the tears back, but it was no use. A single tear slipped down his cheek. The audience watched in stunned silence. Some had already begun wiping their own eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the moment. A veteran in the front row, a man with broad shoulders and a chest adorned with medals, swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he fought back his own emotions. A young woman, barely out of college, covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. Even the reporters, men and women who had spent years in the brutal world of political journalism, sat frozen, their notebooks untouched, their pens unmoving. This was no longer just a political event. It was something deeper, something sacred. His breath unsteady, He had always prided himself on being strong, on being composed, on never letting the weight of the world crush him, but tonight that armor cracked, and the whole world saw it happen. The elderly woman did not move. She stood there unwavering, her piercing gaze locked onto his. She was waiting, not for a rehearsed answer, not for empty words, but for truth. J.D. clenched his jaw, struggling to find his voice. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. I don't know if I have the perfect words," he admitted, his voice raw, thick with emotion. "But I do know this." He paused, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. "God has not abandoned this country." A soft gasp rippled through the room. Some people nodded, others wiped their tears. The elderly woman's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened. J.D. swallowed hard, his throat tight. He glanced around the room, at the faces of the men and women who had come here looking for answers, looking for hope. "They have tried everything to bring him down," J.D. continued, his voice stronger now, though still thick with emotion. "They have thrown every lie, every attack, every weapon at President Trump, and yet he is still standing." A murmur of agreement spread through the audience. Some clasped their hands together, whispering quiet prayers. Others simply nodded, their faces etched with quiet determination. J.D.'s hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but for the first time since this conversation began, he felt something else, too. Something lighter. "Because he is not standing alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears slid down the elderly woman's face, but she did not wipe them away. She simply held his gaze, nodding slowly. J.D. exhaled sharply, his body shaking with the sheer force of what he was feeling. "The people who have failed this country, they want him gone," he said, his voice breaking, "because he is showing them what real leadership looks like. Because he is not afraid to stand up for what is right. Because he fights, not for himself, but for you. For all of us." Someone in the back of the room let out a choked sob. A woman in the front row covered her face with her hands, shaking as quiet tears slipped through her fingers. J.D. Vance's throat tightened again, but he did not stop. And no matter what they try, no matter how hard they fight against him, his voice cracked, and he had to pause to steady himself. He looked up directly into the camera, as if speaking to every American watching at home. "God's plan will not be stopped." The room erupted. People leaped to their feet, clapping, shouting, crying. Some wept openly, others pressed their hands over their hearts. A veteran in the front row, his hands shaking, saluted. Even the journalists who had come expecting nothing more than another routine political event now sat stunned, their eyes glistening with emotion. J.D. Vance wiped his tears with the sleeve of his jacket, struggling to regain his composure. But how could he? How could anyone, after what had just happened? This wasn't just politics anymore. This was something else, something bigger than all of them. The silence that had settled moments ago had transformed into something else entirely, something powerful. This was no longer just a political event. It was an awakening. He looked into the eyes of the elderly woman, the one who had ignited it all. She still stood, her frail fingers gripping the microphone, her silver hair catching the stage lights. She wasn't just asking a question. She was calling for an answer that could define the fate of a nation. J.D. Vance straightened in his seat, his hands still trembling but his heart steady. His voice, though heavy with emotion, now carried an unshakable resolve. "You're right," he said, his words cutting through the room like thunder. "For too long, those in power, those who had the chance to serve this country, failed." The crowd remained silent, hanging on to his every word. The fire inside J.D. burned hotter. He could feel it now. This was bigger than him, bigger than politics. "And now," he continued, "when a man like President Trump stands up and says, 'Enough,' when he fights for this country with everything he has, they don't stand with him. They try to tear him down." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others clenched their fists. The air was shifting, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person in the room. J.D. leaned forward, his voice growing stronger. "But I want you to hear me now. And I want them to hear me now, no matter what they try, no matter how much they lie, no matter how many attacks they throw at him. He slammed his fist on the table. They cannot stop what God has set in motion. A single voice cried out from the back of the room, "Amen." JD felt the shift immediately. The moment was no longer his alone, it belonged to all of them. President Trump fights not just for policies, not just for politics, he fights for the soul of this country. And we, those of us who believe in America, who believe in what is right, must stand with him. JD exhaled sharply, feeling the weight on his shoulders lift just slightly. But he knew the battle was far from over. He turned his gaze to the audience, his blue eyes blazing with conviction. "This isn't just about one man," he said, his voice lowering but carrying even more weight. "This is about the future of this country, about the kind of America we leave for our children, for our grandchildren." The hall was utterly still, yet the air crackled with energy. "They have tried everything," JD continued, "to silence him, to break him, to humiliate him. But what they don't understand is this." He turned to the camera, his gaze steady. "President Trump is not just one man. He is the voice of every forgotten American, every soldier who fought for this country, every worker who lost their job because of failed policies, every family who still believes that America is worth fighting for." A gasp echoed from the audience. JD Vance wiped his sleeve across his face, brushing away the last traces of his tears. But there was no shame in them, no hesitation. "They want him to fail," he said, his voice rising once more. "They want to silence him. They want to destroy him. But they don't understand something. This is not just about him," he declared. "This is about us, about every American who still believes in this country. And I swear to you," his voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward, "we will not let them win." A single voice rang out from the audience. "We won't!" And then another. He slammed his fist against the table. "Donald Trump is still standing, and he is not alone!" The crowd erupted. People leapt to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. JD let the applause thunder for a moment, but he wasn't done. He stood now, his body steady, his heart burning with a fire that could not be extinguished. "USA, USA, USA!" The chant grew louder, spreading until it filled every inch of the hall. JD turned back to the elderly woman. Her eyes, filled with both pain and hope, met his one last time. "Then fight," she whispered. JD Vance swallowed the lump in his throat. "I will," he vowed. "We all will." And at that moment, America woke up. The roar of the crowd filled the hall, shaking the very walls. It was no longer just applause. It was a declaration, a promise, a movement. JD Vance stood at the podium, his hands still trembling but his heart stronger than ever. He had started this night as a leader answering questions, but now he was a man standing for something far greater than politics. He turned back to the elderly woman, the one whose question had changed everything. Her frail hands clutched the microphone, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Yet there was no sadness in them, only conviction. "Then fight," she had told him. And JD Vance had made a vow. "I will," he whispered. "We all will." The room erupted once more. The chant grew louder, wave after wave of voices rising together. "USA! USA! USA!" The sound wasn't just echoing through the hall, it was reverberating across the nation. JD turned toward the camera, his blue eyes locking onto the millions watching from their homes. "To those who seek to tear this country down, let this be your warning. We will not be silent, we will not back down, and we will not let you take this country from us." The audience roared in agreement. People stood with their hands over their hearts, some wiping away tears, others raising their fists in unity. JD's voice softened but carried the weight of a leader who knew the stakes. "This is not just about one man. This is about every American who still believes in the values that built this great nation. If you believe in that, if you still have faith, then stand with us. Stand with President Trump and stand with God." The veteran woman in the front row clutched her chest, her lips trembling as she whispered a silent prayer. Across the country, in living rooms, in diners, in small-town homes, Americans sat in stunned silence, their hearts pounding. JD took one final breath and addressed the nation with the words that would be remembered for generations. If you believe America is worth fighting for, if you refuse to let them win, then make your voice heard. Hit like, share this message, and most importantly, comment below. Tell the world that you will never stop believing, because together we are unstoppable, and together we will save this country. The screen faded to black, but across America the fire had been lit.